All right, so here we are with another interview, and this time we have someone that's at the peak of everyone's mind and attention. It's Glaba. He started off as a player of LittleWarGame who was under the thumb of mods and had to deal with developers, and he has now reached the zenith of his powers because he is the developer and he is over the mods. So come on, Glaba, how are you doing?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. So you started off as a player, but I do want to go back to that beginning section first, which is you started as a player. How did you find Little War Game? I mean, in theory, there are other games to find and to discover, and you could have taken any number of paths through gaming. Why a browser game?
Yeah. So as a kid, obviously, every kid has this problem where they ask their parents, "Can you please get me the game?" And the parent says, "No, you can't have the game." So I think for a lot of people, or at least a lot of kids, browser games are a pretty natural place to go. At least as far as it went for me, I was brought in by the initial Reddit advertising campaign in 2014, and I played, with my brother, a couple friends, and people like that. Uh, and I just sort of stuck around as I made more friends in the community, got better at the game, and I would say really the community is what got me to stick around and all the friends that I made.
Well, that's amazing because I remember when the giant Reddit hit first, the first time. I believe I was on vacation. I go downstairs to a computer. I log in. What? There's 600 people online. How did this happen?
Honestly, I'm amazed the server could take that.
I don't even know how. So, of course, we're going to get into the topic of JBS, the first developer of the game, the person who is the progenitor of Little War Game. But yes, I share that amazement because at that time, I think there were 2 or 3 moderators and JBS. And of course, that was one of the week or 2 weeks for that entire year when I was just mass producing content that I was on vacation. So that would be the one time. I just didn't know that you came from that Reddit wave. So you stuck around. Why? Did you stick around because of the other players or just something to do in combination with it being free and available? How would you describe that?
Well, honestly, I just really like the genre. I mean, I really like the idea of building a base, coming up with these innovative strategies, tricking the other person. I just really like real-time strategy games. And that's not something I actually knew about before Little War Game. This was my first RTS. So yeah, I mean, I guess it was just a combination of liking the genre, meeting people I like to talk with and play with. And yeah, I mean, I would suspect a lot of people have a similar story.
Yeah,
Especially.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think anyone else, to my knowledge at least, came from that 2014 wave. So it was just very interesting. I personally did not know that about you. So one of the things we mentioned and we kind of touched on, and it's got to be a topic because you're the developer now of Little War Game, we kind of have to talk about the previous developer, JBS. Now, I give a lot of credit to JBS because he came up with this game over the summer of, I want to say, 2013 and released it in like very early winter, I want to say, of 2013, and I found the game in 2014. So, and you found the game in 2014 as well. So, this was just his indie project that he had worked on. But I remember being there. There were quite a few frustrations with him. Um, what do you think some of the frustrations were with Jibs? How would you view that? My personal, and here's the way I'll provide context for it. I always thought that JBS was a guy who developed this game kind of for the intention in the way that you found it. He kind of made it as a passion project. And then it just kind of spiraled up as things strangely happen to be. How would you view it? What do you think of this time and of Jibs as a person?
Well, frankly, I don't think I can make any inferences about Jibs as a person. I never really talked to Jibs much. And
Fair enough.
even during the time when Jibs was active, I was a kid. I didn't really have discerning. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't very. I wouldn't say I was a very good judge of character, nor would I say I still am now. But I think Jibs certainly intended for Little War Game to be a project, like you said, and not this game that has this huge community that has all these expectations, and that's sort of reflected in the code base. It's interesting reading through the code. I've sort of it's like a archaeology dig. Like I can sort of see the way Jibs added things like what sort of things he really felt like he was a hurry to add things into, and I don't know, it's just very interesting to see that.
No, that's very interesting because most people aren't developers, and most people, even who are developers, it does take a certain mind to inherit legacy code, as it were. You're receiving, as you said, this trove of how other people think of things. Do you have any interesting insights? Anything particularly that you want to get into that you saw as you went through this like archaeological dig of Jib's thought process?
Well, first and foremost, Jibs is a hip hop fan.
Okay, okay. Come on, you've got to get more than that.
There's all sorts of interesting comments that he wrote to. I mean, of course, I think as we all know, or maybe not everyone knows, but Jibs never really intended for anyone else to read this code. This was his personal project for his own entertainment and enjoyment. So he has a lot of like fun little comments in there that make some references. There's some interesting there's some funny little comments in there. But on a less joking note, I suppose, I think the most obvious part that you can see from the code is what I mentioned earlier, that I think Jibs is under a lot of pressure to, get features out because of this rapidly expanding community that had all these demands. And I think that's very clear in the fact that features tend to be, hacked on almost. And I don't really even blame him because I mean, look at this. He made a fantastic game. It works very well.
We're playing it in 2021. He must have done something right?
Exactly, yeah.
Interestingly, with what we're bringing up here as JBS is the progenitor for LittleWarGame, and then you're now the person who is in development, I have memories of JBS trying to do everything. He was the person who was making features, and he was the person who would moderate, and he was the person who did things with the server, and he would do balance, and he would do just about every facet of LittleWarGame. I can't even imagine doing that. How are you holding up with doing it?
I completely agree with that. Trying to wear all the hats is definitely not feasible, especially if you're not like a full-time on this project. And even if you're full-time, I don't think you can do all those things. And of course, I am not full-time. I'm a student right now, and I'm going to be having a full-time job after I graduate soon. So I have been focusing on delegating a lot of things as much as I possibly can, and getting as much done personally before that point. So, for example, I am not putting any thought or effort whatsoever into game design and balance. I have left that completely to AC, who, if you guys don't know, is one of the best players of LittleWarGame historically.
No matter what ranking, he's like one of the top. He's the top two players historically. You can easily argue for number one among various metrics, right?
Yeah, you could make any sort of argument, but he's definitely there's like that sort of legendary, top three. There's Daz, AC, Slabber. And then as far as moderation goes, I'm also delegating out moderation to you and others, as you know, of course. And as far as development goes, of course, as you also know, AC is helping out with development quite significantly as of recently as well. Silver Boss has been helping out too. And, in an ideal world, we would have a couple more people with a little less commitment. The code would be really organized, and I would just be, reviewing patches that people submit, and there would be like steady development. There would be like a established workflow. The code would be clean.
Okay.
And we'd be able to make steady progress. But we are still a ways from being able to do that.
So one of the things I find interesting about that is that I was around during the same time that you were. We may have even started playing like just a couple of months aside from one another way back in 2014. But I was a bit older and I had a bit more, I would suspect, private messages or talks with JBS. And I do remember that he felt pressured that he had all of these things he had to do. And you seem to have just taken a role in delegation. Where do you think that comes from? Obviously, it seems to work from my perspective, because I remember things like AC Mod, for those who don't know about the history of how Ladder Edition or AA4 or the current 4.3 rank balance happened. People like AC were frustrated with the balance, so they did things like AC Mod. An older moderator at the time, Zhao, and myself had our own private frustrations. Where do you think? Do you think that's an extension of wanting to rush things out to this group of people that, and for a project that was more successful than you thought, or what? Basically, where did the wisdom come from for you to separate these things?
Well, I think as far as balance and game design goes, that was a direct result of seeing what happened with Jibs. Obviously, Jibs wanted to focus on adding these features and the additional like stress of people complaining constantly about balance and design. I mean, I'm sure that must have been very stressful. So the other thing is, I know that Jibs was not the best at the game. I don't think this is a controversial statement,
Not
and
not
I
in
obviously wasn't.
2021, no.
Yeah, and I am definitely also nowhere close to the best of the game. So I don't see why my uh, relatively uninformed and ignorant opinions on balance should be affecting design decisions. Whereas we have a former like StarCraft grandmaster who used to play that game 12 hours a day, who has extensive experience with RTS games in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
If
And
Yeah,
so it's the wisdom of just seeing kind of like we stand on the shoulders of giants. Like you got to see what it was like in action for other people to try and go it alone. So you're deciding not
yeah,
to take that path yourself. Now that's going to sound very weird to people who perhaps aren't programmers or aren't game designers or responsible for a code base. Like, wait a second, this is a game and you're not in charge of game balance or game design, I'm going to feed into the ignorant question here. So, what do you do? What are you working on?
yeah. So at least for 4.3 and even right now, I'm primarily focusing on bug fixes. So uh, the game was always functional, I would say. But there's always been like little weird bugs, just caused by the fact that a lot of features were generally hacked in. And when you end up hacking in things over and over and over again, they end up having like weird sorts of interactions and edge cases that just causes things to break. And there's a lot of detangling of the code that's required to minimize the possibility of these interactions. So that's a big piece. Another big piece that we've been looking at more recently is feature work directed towards certain goals. So, for example, the number one goal that we are focusing on now, other than fixing bugs, is prioritizing the new player experience, for example.
Okay.
Um, and there are a myriad of other categories that we looked at. So, basically, what we're doing is prioritizing these categories in some sort of order and pulling out things to work on under each category. And of course, feature work does come under this as well. For example, we did add a replay window feature to more easily load and autosave replays. As an example, we added frozen map files so that updates to the base game won't break mods, which frees us up to make more aggressive balance changes. We added editor symmetric editing, which was a feature that basically everyone has been asking for a very long time. Um, so there's a ton of stuff that comes with developing the game that isn't just game balance and game design. It
Okay.
is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as I said, I was kind of leaning into it so that you can
Right.
explain maybe even maybe even to yourself or maybe to other people who they don't mean ill by this, they just don't know. So going also with going also into the features and things that have been made, uh, a lot of these things, I don't think people realize that there's a huge amount of testing and work. You keep mentioning that there's a group, and obviously you have said before that you are not the only one who has development access, nor does it sound like you want to be the only person who has developer access. What point would you like to get to? Would you like to get to that point that you said where you're just calmly looking over things and making commitments? Like, how do you see your role growing long term?
Yeah. So I think the amount that I'm working on the game right now is completely unsustainable.
Okay.
I'm going to be working in a job that I would say is more than 40 hours a week. It's probably expecting 50, 60 hours a week. And in addition to that, I would like to enjoy my life. So,
Okay, all right.
so I want to get to a point where maybe I'm spending 5 to 10 hours a week working on this game actively, and we're still able to maintain an aggressive pace of development. And I think there's a lot of code cleanup that has to go into that. A lot of onboarding, almost. I mean, it's almost like a little startup in a way. Um,
So you're taking on the additional responsibility now of basically clearing the path so that if anyone else joins in, or if you want to make future features, you're not fighting a backlog of work.
yeah, actually, so that does remind me of something. As part of the work that I did for 4.3, I would say it's kind of like an iceberg. The changes that were visible to people, that's maybe 20%. 80%
Really,
of the
that
work
lift?
was just like cleanup and maintenance. And the long term intention of that is that people can make changes with less effort, less testing, and less time. So once that, and most importantly, with less understanding of the entire code base, because right now, if you make a change, it ends up affecting so many things. So if you decouple these parts of the code, then that enables people who are not as familiar with the entire code base to make small changes that are much less likely to break things. And of course, when things break, people notice. Like, I tried to be very thorough with my testing, and uh, I'm trying to learn from my mistakes as much as possible, but things slip through the cracks, and so minimizing mistakes is very important.
And that's with the aid of, as you've said, Silverboss and AC for the features that they're providing and the coding work that
Yeah.
they're doing. Let's see, people like Human and a few others that I know of, not off the top of my head, but I know and many other people have looked at PTRs or small updates and said, look, I've
Mhm.
gone through and looked for these bugs. Here's what I found. And then even then, it's just the nature of development because this is what I do for a living as well. Even if you're done with all of that development and everyone says everything's good to go, nothing survives first contact with the customer. And when the customer is something between 8 and 13,000 monthly players, they're gonna find the bugs way before you can find all of them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in an ideal world, you would have an extensive suite of tests for a software project, even one that isn't, you know, that massive like LittleWarGame. But unfortunately, we don't have that, and backfilling that in from where we are right now, that's a massive effort. So the best I can do right now is clean up and rely on manual testing. So yeah,
So with this, when you were saying that you basically also want to have a life, I actually want you to go into that a little bit because for people who don't know, uh, Little Wargame is still an indie game. No one is getting paid huge annual salaries that they can sustain and just work nothing but 40, 50, 60 hours a week on Little Wargame. Like we all have jobs or we're going to school or we're doing something else. Like what has it taken too much on your life? Do you think? Do you want to? I personally would stress that again. Everyone is doing this out of the goodness of their heart, essentially.
yeah. So I mentioned before that I'm a university student right now. So I was on winter break slash Thanksgiving break. It's kind of a weird situation because of COVID.
Okay.
But basically, I was stuck at home, and quarantine means that I basically have absolutely nothing to do on a daily basis. So I would say about like November to end January, I just had like this huge stretch of time where I could just literally wake up, work, eat, and sleep. Um,
Okay.
but now that I'm back to school and working on classes and research and so on, I I don't have that time anymore, and the pace of development has slowed accordingly. Although I now have more help from AC, which has been really useful.
Yeah, he is also a person
And,
who went to school for this and is quite smart in his own right when it comes to
yeah,
development. What do you think about reaching out for more people, either for development or moderation?
yeah. So I think as far as moderation, I'll start with that because it's easier.
Okay.
Obviously, the player base is not that huge right now. And since the game itself doesn't have a very good ability to retain new players, I know you mentioned that like 13,000 unique players a month number. If we
Yes.
kept all those players, we would have hundreds of thousands of players by
Oh,
now.
we'd be
But we
killing the
don't.
game. We would be murdering the
Yeah,
game.
but we don't. And given that fact, the moderation is, I think, the amount of moderation we have is more than sufficient. Um, the most players we have at any given time is 100, like max. So uh, after that development, yes, I would love to have more developers helping, but there is a cost. There's a point of diminishing returns. So there's this law in the computer science called Amdahl's law, and it's like the idea is like you can't just add more and more cores to a machine and make some work get faster and faster. If you have a 2 million core machine, but you're running a job that is essentially just like sequential, there's a what's the word for this? The return you get for adding a new parallel unit of work, which is essentially another developer, is it gets less and less until eventually it doesn't help at all. And I think right now, with the way the code base is all tangled up, adding more people does not really help. So I think that's why I've been focusing so much on code cleanup and code maintenance, because that's what enables more people to be able to help.
Okay. The example that I would use if you haven't run into it before would be there's a book or a treatise written called The Mythical Man Month, where basically it argues that if there's something that is potentially on a time crunch or that people want very quickly, you actually just can't keep, it's much like you're saying, you can't just keep adding development to it. Because even if the code were perfectly organized, those people start intruding on one another, or maybe
Exactly,
they
yeah.
subdivide labor in a way that you personally wouldn't have, etc. Another part of this we haven't really talked about it yet is the game right now is under the ownership of AddictingGames.
Yes.
To what I don't know what you can or can't talk about, so let's just broach in that subject. How did you get to be the developer of LittleWarGame? Because I get people asking me all the time, "You're a mod? What does a mod do? Can I be a moderator?" Dude, I wasn't aiming high enough, apparently. Like, you're just sitting here as the developer. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I'm actually surprised that you don't know. I feel like I've mentioned this before, but I would say like May 2019ish, I was. Oh, okay. I guess there's a bit more context to this. So I've always enjoyed, modding the game, and there have been many others that have modded the game before me, and in the past 6 years. Uh, and so in May of 2019ish, I wanted to add a feature to the editor, and I did, and I sent that patch to Zhao, and he was planning on adding it to 4.4. Although, of course, as we know, plans got delayed and stuff got derailed. But I mean, that sort of got me thinking, why don't I just ask to be a developer? So initially I asked Zhao, can you contact whoever's there at AddictingGames and ask if they can add me as developer? And so Zhao, did send over word. He sent my resume over to them. And eventually when Zhao ended up, stepping down, uh, I contacted Forgeable Sum, who was the person at AddictingGames responsible for LittleWarGame.
Okay.
And uh, there was no one else. There was no one else willing to work on this legacy code base for free, and so I guess I was just the only option there. And Forgeable was like, whatever, might as well give it a shot.
Okay. So it wasn't like you're the person we're looking for. It's more like, you know what? Sure, go at it, kid. Like, enjoy life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he did take a look at my resume and realize that I wasn't like completely unqualified, but I think it was definitely in his mind it was like either no one develops this game, or this kid who wants to work for free develops this game, and maybe I make a little money in the process. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, from cost benefit analysis side, I'll just tell you, there are a bunch of people. There are a bunch of people in other games. They would kill to have some community member be part of the development of the game, because usually there's a sticking point between players and development, right? Like, we're the players and you're developers, and there's a natural miscommunication, or things get too abstracted between us, or we can't get our message spread across. And then there you go. You're no longer a player. Like, you are a player, but you're also this from the community developer. Have you heard anything from them about their thoughts on your perspective of splitting code base up or features or things of that nature? What would you have to say about their involvement?
Yeah. As far as Addicting Games is concerned, Forgeable has primarily just been, giving me access to the servers, setting up stuff with the hosting provider, but he hasn't been too keen on interacting with me with regards to, the actual code.
Okay.
Uh, I think he's just happy that there's updates coming, but I don't think he's too particular on any of the details.
Why do you think? Why do you think that is? Do you get the vibe? Here, I'll just put it this way. Don't speak out of school if you have anything, but do you have you get the vibe that so long as things are moving along merrily and you're not causing trouble, it's good for them, or are they very hands off? How would you describe that?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty accurate. I think Forgeable is focusing on a project like an FPS project. I think some sort of browser game FPS. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
And of course, I mean, he also has a limited set of things he can put his mind on. And LittleWarGame, from what I can tell, is just not that thing right now.
Okay. So what about the community side of it? Again, you by your own admission, you joined when you were a bit younger. So I'm one of the few people who joined when he was a bit older, and it must be strange to the community, or it must be have even been strange to you to then be a developer. How has that reaction been from the player base?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a little mixed. I think the majority of people are definitely happy that there are changes happening. I mean that there's something happening at all instead of stagnation or the game getting worse uh, due to various unintentional bugs that take forever to fix.
Okay.
But of course, there are people that are gonna criticize various things, and of course, it's understandable too. I used to be, the toxic 14-year-old that would insult the moderators and the admin and whatever.
Oh, this is your karmic punishment then.
It's my, I understand that people have strong feelings about the games that they play, that they want the things that they want to be implemented first. And I'll be honest, I don't think I have the best personality at dealing with that either. As anyone who is in this Discord might know, I get fairly easily stressed out by that sort of criticism. But it's something I think I'm getting used to. It sort of comes with the nature of the game. And in fact, I sort of see it as a good thing that people are so passionate about this game that, they're willing to constantly come up with these criticisms. It sort of reflects in a good way that people are really invested in growing this game, even if they express that in a way that's, not a.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the positive spin you would put on it is if they had lost hope or didn't care, that apathy would never get to your ears. But
Exactly.
the fact that people do care and think that they can talk to you and that they might have change affected, it's kind of the circle of life from what used to happen like way back in 2014. It's just the way that things happen, right? It shows that people are excitable.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have another question that goes somewhat along those lines. Again, so you became the developer, you have this code access, you're in charge of so many things. How do you feel about the general player base? Because the reaction that I've seen, just moderating and watching, is that I'm starting to see some of these older names creep up. I'm starting to see people that are on alts that I recognize that maybe other people don't. The average player number seems to be increasing a little bit. And of course, I have some secret analytics sauce in the background. But what has your perspective been? Because I can't imagine the number of points of access or messages or things like that you're getting. What's your sense of where the game is going just in terms of that passion you were talking about?
Yeah. So definitely a couple old players are coming back, but I am a little hesitant to say that this is like a huge deal. Like where the game is growing and this is great. I would say the player numbers are definitely still quite stagnant. A couple old players coming back doesn't mean that the game is growing. So at least in terms of what I think about that, I think what is necessary is more promotion of LittleWarGame, because currently, as far as I can tell, most new players come from the Addicting Games site. They tend to be Americans under 18, usually people like who are in school playing some browser game with their friends. That's just
Okay.
been my observation,
Okay.
and I think if we upped advertising, that would contribute greatly to keeping new players. And the prerequisite for that would be to have a game that can keep new players. I mean, the game as it is right now, I mean, I'm going to be honest, it's really terrible at keeping players and hooking new players. I got some friends to try out the tutorial, and I mean, given the tools that the editor provides, the tutorial, it does its best. But if I'm a new player and I have no idea what the genre is or how to interact with the interface, um, it's really hard. And I've seen some of my friends lose the tutorial. So it's not like they're stupid. I mean, they're perfectly capable people. but,
Right.
but I mean,
I'll put it this way: like people assume right now. Well, if I give them an FPS game, well, of course I'm going to use WASD to move, and I'm going to have the mouse, and it's going to be the gun, and it's going to have aim, and right click is to look down the barrel of the sight for scope, and left click is to shoot, and maybe R is to reload. Look, yeah, that's after 10 to 20 years of FPS being easily the most dominant form of video game played by console and to a lesser extent PC players on the market. Like,
right.
if we lived in an alternate fantasy world where it was like the early 90s and there weren't as many FPS games, like pre-Doom, let's say, you probably have no idea what half of those conventions are, right? It's not that these people are stupid, it's just the way I would express it is that perhaps the floor for RTS is the same as other genres, but most people don't start at its floor.
Yeah, well, I would disagree a bit with that, but I generally agree with the sentiment.
No,
I do
I'm
think
curious
RTS
where the disagreement is.
Okay, I do think RTS is inherently a bit harder to get into because in addition to just the interface, which yeah, you can argue that's just familiarity, there is like things like build orders, um, uh, things like just macroing. These are things that you sort of learn through tribal knowledge by talking to people, reading resources, and so on. This is not stuff that you can figure out on your own without significant amounts of effort. I mean, there's so much that's just figured out about the game that that makes it so that players from 6 years ago are irrelevant. If you could time travel back to 2014 and you had someone play someone from back then, anyone now would probably crush them.
Okay.
Well, not anyone, but like
I know, I get the sentiment. Yeah, no, keep going.
And you can say the same for StarCraft too. If you watch some of the old games from 2010, they're just terrible. Like I could probably beat some of them, and this is just because the community as a whole has just figured out the game better. There's just so much knowledge that's there that can't be communicated through a tutorial.
Okay. So, and you think that makes it fundamentally different from something like an FPS, where it's not just the popularity and like the video game cultural familiarity. It's just asking you to do more.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying that an FPS is easier, but I'm just saying.
No. I'm garbage at FPSs.
Yeah, same.
Okay, there we go. There's the truth. Oh, interesting.
An RTS game is very, very punishing if you don't know if you don't have a base of knowledge. That's the thing.
The way that I would express it, or the way I have always expressed it, I'm curious on your take of this topic, because, obviously you have a hand now in controlling how this changes in the future, so your thoughts on the topic are very relevant. The way that I would express it is that when you play a lot, so I have a friend, he plays either single-player RPGs of whatever form, Borderlands or The Witcher, etc., and he plays FPS games, but the FPS games he tends to play are things like Warzone. If you don't know, it's very similar to Rust or PUBG. It's one of these, you go out, you collect, you get the idea.
Sure.
The way that I would express it is that if you're bad in, let's say, Warzone, it does feel bad that someone shoots you in the back from a brush and you couldn't see them. But that's it.
Yeah.
They surrounded you, shot you with weapons you didn't have access to from a position you just didn't know of. Whereas, so you can kind of think that's chance or a fluke or whatnot. If you sit down and you play a 1v1 game in an RTS, not only are you probably going to lose to any of those more experienced players very badly, but the game almost lets you know that you're not good. Like, you see your money going up really high, you see how long it's been, and you only have one attacking unit. Like, do you think that's something you want to work on? What do you think of this?
I mean, yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, you put in 5 minutes into building this beautiful base, you have all these neatly organized buildings, and then this guy just comes in with 150 units and just kills everything. It's like, this is stupid, and it's like you wasted that time. Like, you put in all that work and absolutely nothing came of it, nothing positive at all. So in terms of addressing this, currently, we have to do this step by step. Currently, there's no way new players even learn the interface. So that's like by far the most basic prerequisite. They need to learn the interface to be able to play the game. People generally figure it out, but imagine what percentage of people we're losing that just don't bother to figure out because they're like, this is too complicated. On top of that, we have things like build orders, macro, micro. And I think, yeah, even in StarCraft, this is something that is primarily handled on a community basis. There's not really any integration into the game other than, some mods like the Salt build order trainer.
Okay.
But this is something that we would want to work into LittleWarGame potentially at some point in the future. Something that teaches you builds, alerts you about macro, links to wikis, articles written by community members. I know like Norm has written good articles. I mean, a lot of people have written good articles in the wiki. But yeah, honestly, I don't know of like a fundamental way to increase that or to lower that skill floor. I think it's a hard problem, and most RTS games have not figured it out.
Yeah, most. It seems just from, we're not going to get into the specific games because we're not here for those games, but I've been part of a couple of technical pre-alphas and betas for a variety of other, let's say, attempting RTSs or reimagining of the RTSs. They tend to take this angle of, well, we'll encourage the team aspect. We'll encourage that you have a teammate or someone to group with. I will just say anecdotally, I don't know what angle you want to take on this, but my experience has been the people that stick around, it's because they tend to show up and play 2v2 symmetry, either with some random other person or with their buddy. Because as you said, most of these people, they don't have a nice computer to go buy things. They're playing this game when perhaps they don't either have the money or the time to play something else, but they get hooked because it is a bit simpler and they can play with somebody else and have fun. Do you think?
Sure.
So I'll try this angle. Do you think that the problem of it being a 1v1 RTS even needs to be solved? Because we have a lot of people that play mods. I mean, you've got to be thrilled with that, right?
Yeah, I definitely don't think that saying this is a 1v1 competitive game is the way to go. I mean, over half the player base plays this game casually. Probably close to half the player base plays primarily mods. And that's not something I want to throw away. I mean, map makers have put in so much effort into making very high quality mods. I mean, just look at it. Just look at the most popular mods. Like
there is a guy named Red Wars Legend, and there's another guy who's I think I forget his name, but he's got something like 8,000 unranked games, and like 7,500 of them are Raid Wars. Like, you see the people who play Hero Arena 3v3 and all of this. Like, yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. So
yeah.
So with
that,
I
have no intention of forcing people into playing a 1v1 competitive experience. Although, of course, that is my personal preference. But
well, I think that's relieving, actually. Like, maybe your personal preference as a player, what I would get out of that is that your personal preference as a player isn't overriding what the natural market seems to be for the game.
Yeah. That said, I do want to make competitive more accessible, because obviously the situation we had with 4.2 of competitive just being another mod, I think that led to community fragmentation.
Okay.
And it was also very confusing for new players. So I do think that having a base game that is balanced around a 1v1 competitive is a good idea. But definitely mods and team games, they still are quite important and will definitely never be like